So, hi, Ankie. Nice to have you here with us. We are very honored to have Miss Ankie Ng, the CEO and founder of Shifted, which is Hong Kong's first advisory firm dedicated to outcomes-based financing. She did her Master of Public Policy at Oxford and also got her bachelor degree in international relations at Toronto in Canada. So throughout her career, Ankie has had a very rich experience in the impact domain. So Ankie, if you can share with us your journey in founding Shifted.
Sure, Kartik. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be speaking to everyone here today at Scaleup Impact Summit. So I'll share a little bit about my journey. Basically, I came from an investment banking background. I previously covered equity research in China utilities and renewable energies. Around 2014, however, at the first onset of social unrest, I felt that intrinsically that the fundamentals of society were quite off kilter. So it really sparked off my passion in trying to figure out how can I utilize my financial skill sets for the greater good. And eventually I then moved into the impact investing space in Hong Kong and worked for a venture philanthropic firm based in Hong Kong as well. As Kartik mentioned, I found my way back to the UK, where I did my Master in Public Policy, as I was very interested in understanding how can we learn from public policy arena to then grow this space that is, at that time, it was quite nascent in terms of impact investing. So I spent some time in the UK government, helping them develop policies and thinking through impact investing and pension funds. And I also spent some time at a UK-based private equity focused on sustainable investing. It was around my time in the UK where I then came into concepts of outcome-based financing, or OBFs in short. And I was inspired to bring these concepts back to Hong Kong. And so this is when I came back to Hong Kong to found Shifted, and where we focus on OBF advisory.
That's awesome, Ankie. Thank you for sharing. So as we know, right, many people are still unaware about what OBF is, outcomes-based financing is. So if you can please tell for our audience, what is OBF? And if you can share any example, that will be great.
Absolutely. I will share one brief slide with the audience here. So I hope everyone can see this. Basically, this is a very general model of how outcome-based financing works. And I'll just brief everyone here to get everyone up to speed on what OBFs really are. So generally speaking, we have four key stakeholders when it comes to any OBF structure. We have the social investor, we have the service provider. This can be revenue generating as in a social enterprise, or it can be a nonprofit. We then have an independent evaluator, and then finally we have an outcomes pair. How this model works is essentially the social investor provides upfront capital to the service provider. And so the service provider then goes off and generates any social outcome or environmental outcome that their project is targeting. Then we have an evaluator, a third-party evaluator that then verifies the achieved outcomes. Once verified, the outcome pair can be government, or it can be a philanthropic donor of some sort, basically any capital that is that has zero expectation of financial returns. So they then pay the social investor back contingent on the performance of the service provider. So this is generally a nutshell of what an OBF structure could look like. Of course, there are many derivatives of this form. I will stop here in terms of the general model, but in going back to your question about specific examples. So Shifted is working on an EdTech project at the moment based loosely on this structure, and it's called an impact loan. So how it works is that it's the interest rates that is provided back to the investor by the service provider is inversely correlated to the performance it has achieved. In other words, if the service provider performs better, they pay lower interest rates, and vice versa on underperformance.
That's great explanation. Thank you so much, Ankie. I think even the audience must be enlightened by this. Just continuing our discussion, probably on the on the ESG and startups, ESG and impact led startups, sustainability and impact led startups. I think there are some challenges they face. If you can also throw some light on the challenges.
Sure. Yes, there are many challenges that startups and other service providers face when it comes to operating in the impact and sustainability arena. One of the major challenges that they do face is around the subject of impact measurement. So how do you measure your project to ensure that your targeted outcomes are actually achieved? So this in itself is subjected to debate because of the intangibility and the subjectivity of outcomes itself. It's not a financial output per se. So in that sense, OBS really try to solve for this. And how we do that is that we design in a link between how do we tie in funding, the financing component, to the actual outcomes itself. And because of this link, there's a robustness in how we create the accountability and transparency in impact measurement. So I'll give a quick example. So how we would usually do it in the scope of an outcome OBF model is that we usually use a robust methodology that is a statistical methodology such as an effect size. Now, how do we measure is, for example, we would use a pre and post analysis. So if a beneficiary goes through any service, we would measure the impact of how the beneficiary has benefited before and after a specific project. Now we will have two groups separate. We will have the control group and the experimental group. The control group means that it does not receive the intervention at all, and the experimental group means they receive the intervention. The delta, which is a change in between, gives us the impact. So we incorporate these elements when we design in the OBS, so we ensure that there's accountability in linking funding to outcomes. And therefore, we are, as a space, trying to solve for the impact measurement challenge.
Great, and just curious about, since continuing the topic of OBF, since we are in Asia and especially Hong Kong, where do you think we are in terms of the development of the OBF system or OBF ecosystem over here?
Yeah, so in Hong Kong, there is ample opportunity, of course. We are a international financial center. We have an abundance of resources and talent where with such great minds, we could definitely think more and better and more effectively when it comes to innovative financing and moving more funding towards social and environmental outcomes. And I can speak generally that this is quite similar across the board in Asia. We also see there's greater experimentation in likes of Japan, Singapore, and Southeast Asia when it comes to outcome-based financing. However, I do want to caveat that one of the challenges and hurdles in really scaling up in terms of OBF development in Hong Kong and perhaps the rest of Asia as well is really a mindset issue. In Asia, we have seen less of a cross-pollination of talents. What I mean by that is that people moving from private to public to civil society across academia. And in order to really grow an effective and innovative OBF market, we need more cross-pollination of these types of talents so that we really can grow new and hybrid products together as a collective. So while I see a lot of opportunity, we do as a collective have to come together and think more disruptively of how we can better financial structures for the greater good.
Good, and just picking up the word scaling up, I think as you mentioned, a lot of OBS, they do find difficulty in scaling up in Hong Kong. Just taking this topic to a more general theme about sustainability and impact, I think one of the challenges that impact and sustainability-led startups face is in scaling up. So I would just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really great question as well. And it's generally a question we hear a lot when it comes to investors on the investor side, as well as people who are interested in founding a startup, because scale in itself is intrinsically linked to the idea of success and reward. But I may put a damper in this type of thinking by actually saying that not all social ventures should and can scale up. I'm not saying that there aren't examples where there are successful cases of scale up. I'm just saying not every project should scale up. And why do I say that? Because if we look at, if we add on the element of developing markets and developed markets, the types of needs of these two markets are very different. Now, in a developing market, a lot of the needs of underprivileged groups are basic necessities. Let's say, for example, water sanitation or access to basic education or basic healthcare. Then a developed market. So in that case, it's essentially and relatively easier to develop a project or some sort of concept that can scale to and further reach out to greater groups. But in the developed market context, if you think about the needs, it's actually very bespoke. For example, if I use Hong Kong as a case study as well, what we're facing are actually the needs of how do we create more 21st century skills, for how do we enhance 21st century skill sets of underprivileged children, for example. Digital literacy is another issue. And so these the very bespoke needs may not be something that is easily scalable. It's actually about going deeper within an individual. So in that case, it's about the quality of service rather than the quantity. So that is the reason why I'm saying not all projects may have the ability to scale up.
That's indeed an eye-opener for me, and also I think most of the audience, that when you shared that not the sustainability or impact-led startups, some of them should not be scaled up. So I'm sure our audience, a lot of it's an eye-opener for many people in the audience. So thank you for sharing that as well. And lastly, and just continuing the conversation further, just would love to know, what are you guys at Shifted working on? What are you and your team working on? What's the next project in Hong Kong, especially, if you can share, or beyond?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking that question. So at Shifted at the moment, we're thinking more in long-term and sort of more disruptively of what outcome-based financing could mean for Hong Kong and beyond. So since our lessons learned in developing OBFs in the form of impact loan and more sort of version 1.0, as we call it, models of OBF, we're now thinking, what does a version 2.0 look like? What does a version 3.0 look like? And what's exciting is that because the OBF market is nascent in Hong Kong, we can actually leapfrog and jump generations by learning what had happened in other countries, such as the UK, the US, etc., and then grow it much faster in Hong Kong, and understanding what is the unique context that makes Hong Kong, Hong Kong, and Asia, Asia. And so in that sense, me and my team and I, and also our partners, are thinking, how do we merge the concepts of ESG much more with impact? Because there's still essentially a gap between these two thematic approaches when it comes to investing. And not only are we thinking about merging and creating a sort of a hybrid thematic in between, we're also thinking about various different types of asset classes that haven't been tapped into yet. So on that note, we're still working on it. So some of the details I'll leave out for the sake of this talk. But what I can say is that we are targeting to launch an impact fund And we will be supporting tech startup mainly with a sustainability and impact angle. And we're looking for it to launch first half of next year.
That's excited. That's exciting. I'm really excited to know your further developments. And, just learning, I'm sure many in the audience are also looking at where Shifted is going, since you are probably the only sort of OBF advisory firm in Hong Kong. So I'm sure a lot of people who are interested in impact are looking at Shifted very keenly. And and just going back to our topic on OBF, so how do you really identify OBF opportunity or investment? So what are the due diligence that you can do? If you can share some of that with the audience.
Yes, of course. When it comes to deal sourcing and how do we identify what's a good project that could fit into an OBF model, I think it's quite typical in terms of the deal sourcing process that any other VC or private or PE would go through. So but what we look for specifically in an OBF structure is the alignment of values first. So what I mean by that is that we really need to define what we're trying to do as in terms of the social outcomes target or the environmental outcomes target. And we need to be very clear that it's outcomes first and then finance second. And we don't want to beat around the bush when it comes to these priorities, because once you deprioritize or you have a different consensus of what these priorities mean for each partner, it could create a lot of not just confusion, but it can create issues further down the line. And so we look at value first, and then finance as a secondary motive to really help drive the efficiency on how we achieve outcomes. So that first of all. Second of all, really aspects of the team, the founder, the team will. The journey of developing an OBF model, an OBF project is actually very challenging. And the reason being is that because for the first time, you have different sectors coming together. You have public, you could have academia, you have private. So all the mindsets coming together can actually create a lot of challenges in itself. And again, a lot of the times can come from a mindset and cultural issues that is specific to the sector that the individual or the organization comes from. So we really need to have strong team will when it comes to the founder level and down the verticals of the entire team as well to help persevere and help overcome the challenges we'll be seeing as we develop the OBF together.
I mean, yes, that's really great sharing. Also, just hearing your journey, founding Shifted, and also hearing about your project, I'm sure, when you had conversations with potential investors, regulatory people, government people, you may have come across some misconceptions they have about OBF per se. So if you can share some of your own experiences in encountering them as to what are the common misconceptions people have?
I think when it comes to rather than misconception is rather an education process, because there are, yes, so because the model hasn't been clearly defined in Hong Kong and we haven't seen any strong pilot cases just yet. So all of them are still in R&D or they're still in their very preliminary stages of piloting. So we haven't had the full results factored in yet. So in that sense, misconceptions have not been quite shaped. However, on that note, misconceptions have been erased by how people look at this as only a type of as a funding structure specifically, and not understanding that this model in OBF is actually an evolving model and it has multi-dimensional aspects to it where it can be a policy tool. It can also be seen as an organizational efficiency tool, how it creates more effectiveness and efficiency among service provider. And this is very strong, what we've seen when it comes to pushing for more efficiency when it comes to nonprofits, because for the first time, they are now looking at how do you create results-based management by linking it to results-based performance. So on the other aspect, there are many ways to look at it. So therefore, because there are multiple ways to look at it, there could be misconceptions. So eventually, the ambition is that as we see more successful cases come through to Hong Kong in the next year or so, in the near term at least, we will be able to have more successful cases where we can share and eliminate further misconceptions around the ideas of OBF.
Great. And yes, what you said is very true. There is a problem of education. So, is Shifted also working to educate the community at large on what is OBF exactly and how to measurements, everything we spoke about?
Yes, so another pillar that Shifted works on is on thought leadership and evidence-based research. And our first two pillars are OBF structuring and designing, and our second pillar is performance management and capacity building of service delivery. So going back to the third pillar, thought leadership and evidence-based research, we do think it's our responsibility to help steer the conversations on how the market looks at OBS. Again, because of the challenges I highlighted previously to your question, which is because there's so many multi-dimensional ways of looking at OBF, we really need a steering in how we look at this, how do we define this, and how do we measure even the success of any cases. So we do engage in that, but we also do it quite selectively too. It really depends on the context and the audience as well involved and the participants involved. So we engage primarily in, for example, in universities. We would have talks to university students, undergraduate, masters as well, master degree students. We also speak to in roundtables and also across to different investors as well.
Great. And also to add some voluntary things. So that's how we actually met when, I started volunteering for you. So I think that's also another important way that people can continue learning about what OBF is and what impact is and what are the common, how the common misconceptions can be erased. So yes. And just for the people, I'm sure a lot of young people would really like to make a career in impact. They really care about some of those values they believe in. So any advice for the people who want to start a career in impact? I mean, going back to your own journey, whether it's better to work in a corporate first, and then you go into impact and bring some of the corporate values there. So if you can share some of your thoughts around that subject.
Yeah, absolutely. Very happy to share that. And I understand from our sharing previously, there's a large majority of students in the audience who are interested in perhaps pursuing an impact-led career. So I'm very happy to share my experiences here too. So I think it's a bit of both. It's very important to learn the hard skills you would in corporate. So for example, if it wasn't for my investment banking experience and equity research and learning financial modeling, I wouldn't be able to get to the stage now where we can think about new hybrid models of how we look at OBFs. Now, that said, I also would advise, and if I could speak to a younger version of myself, is that I wish I also understood what my passions were in the very beginning and what are my key interests of how do I want to create impact in society. So if I entered the corporate world with that lens, I would be able to pick and choose the types of skill sets to then better create impact in the long term. So my one advice to the audience is really to go through that personal journey first of understanding what are your passions, what's your purpose, what are you interested in seeing your impact in the world. If you're able to answer these questions, you're able then go on to the trajectory of doing corporate, etc. But I would also advise the audience to do more, jump across different sectors as well. You don't have to do it as a job. for example, as Kartik mentioned, you can do it on a volunteer basis too, and you can pick projects on a pro bono basis to then pick up the skill sets of different sectors. So then you get a chance to really understand what's the culture like in the public sector, what's the culture like in civil society. And with this cross-pollination that you can do in a pro bono lens, for example, or as part of your career path, you're able to really understand how can you create a project or a startup that has a better way to improve the way we look at delivering social and environmental outcomes.
That's very great advice. Thank you so much, Ankie, for your sharing. I think we are more or less done unless the audience has any questions. So one of the question is basically, how do you, like in a corporate setting, how do you actually go about, like, for example, me, I'm very passionate about, a value, and in the corporate setting where I'm sort of fixed in a department, how do I sort of pick up various skills? Because if I'm stuck in a department, say 1 or 2 years, I will just end up picking up one set of skills. So if you can share with the younger audience, how do you go about navigating various departments when you're working? I think that's something even you might have come across when you had started.
I think one way to look about this is to be more open-minded in your approach to your job. So while yes, there's one way of looking at with a glass half empty and say, hey, for this specific job, I'm only picking up these specific skill sets. So if you flip the conversation, you flip the script around and say, actually, it's a glass half full opportunity. I can really put my hand up and, like say, hey, I want to be part of this specific project where I can learn communication skills or pitching skills or creating decks as opposed to creating a model. I think it really comes to your personality as a person to be much more proactive and ask for these opportunities, and also speak to your boss or your mentor within the company to let them know what are your goals in the future. And of course, this is dependent on your relationship with them. If they're supportive, they will put you in specific projects or opportunities that can help you and enable you to achieve your wider spectrum of goals for yourself. Another thing is that don't stop short within your role within a job. Go look for opportunities outside the job. Kartik is a very great example of that. He volunteers, he does pro bono, and in that, he's able to widen his network and skill sets as well. So if I were the audience, I would also speak to Kartik and how he approaches this as part of his sort of pathway in widening his skill sets. So again, I won't stop short within a corporate role. Look outside your corporate of ways to be part of the community. And there are also other things you can do. You can, be part of a advocacy group, or again, be part of an NGO. There are a lot of skill sets they need from corporate as well that you can therefore help enhance their objectives. And again, it's a trade-off. You can also learn from them too. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Absolutely. What you're saying is right. And I think I was just, as you said, I was just reflecting I was reflecting on my own journey when I started working after graduating, working ex-investment banker like you again, stuck to a department, but I wished I had actually spoken to my boss and my mentor more so that I could explore various areas, which I realized later, and I managed to do that later. But yes, if I can do that younger, that would have been awesome. But thank you so much, Ankie, for your sharing. It's been great. It's been great having you and speaking to you and also learning from you at the same time. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me here again. It's been wonderful speaking to you and to the audience.
Great. Thank you so much, Ankie.
Thank you. Bye.